Good afternoon. Welcome to the February Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be an informative look at OneDrive and Dropbox as possible file storage in the cloud solutions. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the president of Community IT. As always, we encourage you to interact with us by asking questions via the GoToWebinar chat feature. You can also connect with us on Twitter. We can be followed at Community IT, and we'll be tweeting throughout the webinar today. Just a reminder to avoid multitasking during the webinar. You may just miss the best part. If you do miss the best part, or you need to leave the webinar early, we'll be posting links to the recording and the slides of today's webinar on our website. In case you're not familiar with Community IT, our skilled and certified team of IT professionals serves the Greater Washington nonprofit community, helping organizations of all sizes and capacities to advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community, have served over 900 nonprofit organizations since 1993, and we take a strategic and collaborative approach that fits the unique needs and culture of nonprofit organizations. And now it's my pleasure to turn the webinar over to today's presenters, our project manager, Steve Longenecker, and one of our network managers, Patrick Spree.
Good afternoon. This is Steve Longenecker, and again, this presentation is about OneDrive versus Dropbox and in the cloud file storage.
Hi, this is Pat Spree. Our agenda today, we'll start with talking about why we want to move to the cloud, just in general. We'll talk about some basic information about file storage, again, sort of a general approach. And then we'll discuss the specific problems regarding moving to the cloud, in particular what Steve and I call the gap problem. Then we'll discuss Dropbox and OneDrive specifically, and then we will have some questions.
So, the first question you have to ask is why the cloud? And we don't just mean why the cloud in terms of file storage, but why the cloud in general. And this is a story that I think you've heard before if you've attended other community IT webinars, because the cloud is something that we think many of our nonprofit clients would benefit from. And the idea here basically is that cloud providers aggregate the needs of many customers. So they can achieve economies of scale that most of our customers couldn't achieve on their own. So to have the level of availability and stability and the amount of features that cloud providers can provide, to do that on your own, on-premise, would require huge investments in server infrastructure and software that it's hard to defray over over an organization that's between 10 seats and even 300, 400, 500 seats. Much better to work with a cloud provider who focuses on just providing a specific service. They have their own data centers, with redundant power, redundant internets, redundant servers, and they can do all this with economies of scale at a lower cost and with less maintenance and overhead for our clients than you could achieve on your own doing it on premise. It doesn't always mean that it actually costs less than having something offered through your own server, because nonprofits, because they qualify for nonprofit pricing, oftentimes can set up their own server relatively inexpensively, but you're not going to have nearly the availability and stability that you will from a cloud provider. And in general, there's no question that moving to the cloud is the direction that we think our clients need to go.
So let's talk about storing files before we talk about specifically storing files in the cloud. For our purposes, there are really three types of file storage places. The first is local storage, and by this we mean storage on your individual computer, or a USB stick or an external hard drive plugged directly into your computer. And the advantage of this is that it's very fast. You can very quickly access and open, your files. It's inexpensive. You just need to pay for an external hard drive. You can get, a terabyte, 1,000 gigabytes, for about $100, possibly even less. It's very flexible. You can arrange your files and folders in any way you choose. The disadvantage, of course, is that you have no remote access. There's no manageability in terms of access and workflow, and there's really no collaboration. I mean, the best you have is, you can hand your USB stick to someone else, or you can email files around, but that's not real collaboration. The next step up is the network file storage, and this is typically on a file server, sometimes on a network attached storage device. And again, this is fast. It's easy to use, uses that same Windows Explorer interface that local storage does. This allows some collaboration. Typically, a server will have a file locking mechanism, so if one person has a file open, another person can't use that file. But once that first person closes the file, that second person can then access the same file. There is centralized management and security. You can run virus scan on the server to keep it secure. You can control who has access to different files and folders. You can control user accounts. You can set password complexity requirements and expiration dates. The disadvantage is that you do still have limited remote access. You're basically restricted generally to either a remote desktop server, which can be expensive, or a VPN, which often is suboptimal. It's also not cheap compared to other options. You do have to pay for the expense of a server. You have to pay for management of the server. So that brings us to cloud file storage, which has a lot of advantages, hopefully, over local storage and network storage. It's accessible from anywhere, pretty much any device. You still have that centralized management. You still have that centralized security. You have a lot of business continuity in it. As Steve mentioned, when a service is moved to the cloud, generally these cloud service providers will have redundant servers. They'll have redundant internet connections. They'll have backup power supplies. They'll often have multiple data centers. So if one part of that goes down, another part will step in and will continue providing the service. Collaboration can be a pro. Cost can be less expensive. The reason we have a lot of question marks here is because a lot of this actually depends on what option you choose. So, for example, in the cons, security, some cloud options don't have very good security options. They'll have a password, but there's no emphasis on, there's no enforcing a complex password, for example. The same with scalability. Some options are very good for small clients, for small purposes, but are very difficult to scale upward when you have a lot of data, a lot of people. Collaboration, we'll talk more about this a bit later, but often that file locking that I mentioned is lacking, and there can be conflicts with that. And again, some of these options can be more expensive.
So now I want to talk about what Pat and I have been calling the gap problem. And I think we made this up. Certainly we didn't mean to copy it from somebody else. But if there's somebody else talking about a gap problem, then I mean it seems like an obvious idea. And the idea here is that the problem with cloud storage is that the files are in a data center on the internet, so they're in the cloud. But the software that you're using to manipulate the data, to create files, to modify files, that's running on your computer, and there's a gap between the two. Now, this can manifest. Used to be a bigger problem when their bandwidths were less than they are in this days. It manifests itself simply as the fact that when you opened a file, it might take a while, because if you're doing that on a slow internet connection, it might take a while to open a file up, and that's annoying. But it's also a problem in other ways. For example, the collaboration piece that Pat just mentioned. So if you if there's a file in the cloud and you want to you need to work on it, so you're going to work on it using software that's running on your computer. So you download it, you open it, you're working on it. Meanwhile, one of your coworkers has done the same thing with the same file, and then both of you are done. You close the software that we were using to work on the file. You put the file back in the cloud in the new version, and there's two versions, and it's unclear which version is the version that has the most value in it. Hopefully both versions still exist and you can compare and maybe copy and paste from one to the other, but it's suddenly what's supposed to help with collaboration is actually making things difficult. And that's just another example of this gap problem. So there are a number of different approaches to sort of solving the problem that the software is on your computer but the files are in the cloud. So that first manifestation that I was talking about, where it's just a pain to get the file out of the cloud and onto your computer, was sort of the first sort of way that this gap, before even worried about collaboration and other things, people using cloud storage meant downloading a file, maybe using a web browser or an FTP client or something to get your file, working on the file, and then using your browser or FTP client to put it back in the cloud. And that was just unworkable as a regular solution, and it wasn't going to happen. So utilities, service providers came up with these utilities to sort of create a local copy of your store on your local hard drive, and this approach we call the file sync approach, and that we didn't make up. That's everyone talks about that. So Dropbox is not the first to do this, but they are certainly the ones that in the consumer market made their names doing it, and they do it very well. So you have, and the screenshot here shows it, in my computer, I have a Dropbox node, and it behaves just like any other folder in File Explorer on my Windows 7 machine. I can click on files, they open, and I'm essentially opening up local files, and I can manipulate them with my local software and then save them back to this folder on my hard drive, and then the utility syncing software syncs that software behind the scenes back to the cloud. We have in gray here, Box does that, Google Drive can do that, Microsoft's OneDrive for Business can do that. The asterisk on Microsoft OneDrive is there because we don't think Microsoft's OneDrive's syncing utility has been, it's been the least reliable. Dropbox seems almost, well, it's not bulletproof, but it's really pretty good. Microsoft's OneDrive seems like it's always getting hung up and needs to be resynced manually, and it's a lot of work. So its performance is less than we'd like it to be. Another approach to this gap problem is to sort of move the software off of your local computer and put the software in the cloud. And Google was the sort of the pioneer on this. They were the ones who populated it with their Google Docs. Google Apps. It's pretty cool. So you have in the case of a document, with a word processing document, you actually in your browser you have a fairly feature-rich document editor, and you actually are working in the cloud on your file in the cloud. Microsoft OneDrive does this quite well. It's not Microsoft OneDrive's editor has gotten very good. It looks a lot like the full-blown. I'm talking about Word specifically here, but Excel also, PowerPoint also. Their browser editors aren't nearly as full-featured as the software that like Office 2013 that runs on your computer, but it's pretty good for quick and dirty work. I'd say richer certainly richer than Google Docs. I feel like Google put their thing out there and said this is good enough and hasn't really improved things a lot since then. Box has a fairly simple editor. So they get the asterisk. They provide this service. Dropbox doesn't do this at all. This approach is kind of neat in one respect, in that the collaboration problem can go away in this case, and Google Drive is again perhaps the slickest manifestation of this. With Google Drive, you can be editing a spreadsheet. I almost call it an Excel spreadsheet, but you can be editing a spreadsheet or a Google Doc, word processing doc, and you can actually see your collaborators, their cursors moving around in different colors, and text can be edited. And my son, who uses Google Docs at school, like they make games out of this where they're deleting and adding words back and forth. And anyway, it's really cool. OneDrive's browser editors aren't quite that slick. You don't actually see the other cursors moving around, but you do see the stuff, the changes happening sort of almost in real time. The third approach to this gap problem is to have really tight integration of the software with cloud services. So you're not so much focused on a synced folder on your hard drive, but you have your local software that's running on your computer, so Office 2013 in our example, or Word 2013 in our screenshot example. But when you're actually saving things or opening things, the cloud drives are presented right there. Now, whether those drives are local copies, sync copies, or you're actually sort of having a window into the cloud service, I think it can vary. My perception often with Microsoft OneDrive is I'm actually seeing a window into OneDrive in the cloud and not a synced folder. Although it feels like it varies depending on. I'm not sure why it varies. So Microsoft, of course, OneDrive is like the best at this for Office integration, and that's not a surprise because Microsoft owns Microsoft Office and it owns OneDrive, so they ought to be able to get it tightly integrated, and they do. It's pretty good. Earlier versions of Office, not so well. Mac for Office, not as well, but workable. But Office 2013, very solid, I would say, in my experience, and I'm looking forward to the new version of Office that's coming out at the end of this year, I think, because I expect it to even get better. So OneDrive's the star for Office integration. Of course, Dropbox has announced a partnership with Microsoft just recently. Right now, their integration is pretty much only on the mobile versions of Microsoft Office, so Office for Android and Office for iOS. But they integrate, and I expect that they're going to continue to work on that integration. And then we have Box here because this is kind of the niche that Box is trying to make for itself. And it does have plugins for Office, but it also has plugins for Google Drive and for Salesforce. So they're trying to sort of be the agnostic provider that takes care of all the different third parties and plugs into all of them and has this tight integration. So those are the three approaches to how to solve this gap problem.
So that gets us to why we're talking about Dropbox and OneDrive specifically. Generally, it's because Dropbox and OneDrive both have a very large user base. They're familiar to people, Dropbox mostly from the consumer side, OneDrive from the business side, since it's part of Office 365. Dropbox is also just a really solid example of that file syncing approach, which all of them pretty much have to some degree or another. But Dropbox is really the standout among them in terms of that approach. It's also a good standalone solution, as Microsoft OneDrive can be. Well, Microsoft OneDrive, on the other hand, is kind of the flip side, is that it's part of kind of the larger Office 365 ecosystem in the Microsoft Office ecosystem. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin in that sense, that Dropbox kind of stands on its own in terms of a cloud file solution, and OneDrive is part of kind of a bigger picture. As Steve mentioned, Box is an interesting option in this field as well. It has integration with Google Apps, with Salesforce, with Office 365, and a whole lot of other business applications. And Google, of course, has their own option that's part of their Google Apps platform as well. So specifically about Dropbox for Business. Dropbox was launched in 2008, so about 7 years ago, not too long ago. It has a very similar experience to using local storage. You're essentially using the Windows Explorer, or if you're on a Mac, the Mac Finder, to open files and folders the same way you normally would. So the Dropbox utility then takes your files, any changes you make, any files you create or delete, and it synchronizes them to any other computers, including the Dropbox servers. And it's from those servers that you can access Dropbox through their website if you happen to be on a computer that you don't have Dropbox installed on. Maybe it's a friend's computer, or you're on a public computer and you just quickly need to access a file for something. In terms of collaboration, Dropbox uses something called team folders, which are organization-wide folders that are open to everybody in the organization. Everybody who has an account on your Dropbox for Business account has access to the team folders. For departments that need to restrict folder access controls, like if you have a finance department and you want to restrict access to those files and folders, then an individual user would need to share those files or folders with that smaller group. You can't restrict the team folders to a smaller group. So in a sense, you can't really centrally manage the control of those shared folders. It needs to be managed by the users. Because file syncing is all that Dropbox does, it's a very simple interface, and it's a very simple utility. So it's very easy for you to start using Dropbox right away and just go. Just hit the ground running. There's not a whole lot of change required. I also wanted to quickly mention where Dropbox is kind of headed for the future. As you may have heard, they did recently announce back in November a partnership with Microsoft. So far that's mostly in the mobile sphere, so that if you are editing a document in Dropbox, you can actually open it in Office for iPad or Office Mobile on Android or the iPhone or whatever. It's also worth noting that Dropbox has made over a dozen acquisitions over the past few years. A recent one, for example, was a company called Cloud On, which was a kind of an online document editing platform. So it seems like they may be headed in the direction of offering the kind of services that OneDrive and Google Drive are offering with editing in the cloud. So some pros and cons for Dropbox for Business. It's, as I mentioned, it's very easy to use, very little change management required, and it does not require a constant internet connection because it keeps a copy of your documents on your local computer. Once you've edited or changed the documents, and once you've reconnected to the internet, it will then synchronize and update those changes, or will download the changes that someone else may have made to a shared folder. The disadvantage is that it has poor scalability. It can require a lot of local storage. If you work at an organization where maybe the shared folder consists of 500 gigs, well, you can imagine syncing 500 gigs of shared data plus any changes that that data is made to that data can be a little overwhelming for Dropbox, especially if you have say even 20 users in the office, all one person changes a file and then it needs to be synced to 20 different people. It's going to take up a fair amount of bandwidth. The collaboration is also very lacking with Dropbox, I noticed. If two people are editing the same file, what will happen is Dropbox will create what it calls a conflict copies. And what that means is that there will essentially be, as Steve mentioned, 2 copies of the same file, and you'll need to sort out how to figure out what you want to keep from each file. So Dropbox really works best if you are an organization that does not have a lot of collaborative data and you develop workflow around the collaboration limitations. Just quickly, some technical specifications. Dropbox has unlimited storage in the cloud, has unlimited file versioning, meaning it will keep track of changes to a file going back to the beginning of time. There have very non-existent file limitations. It's you can have files of pretty much any size as long as you're willing and able to wait for super large files to upload and download as they synchronize. The cost is about $15 per user per month, minimum of 5 users. There is a discount for nonprofit, and there's also a discount for annual subscriptions over monthly subscriptions. Security is still fairly limited. Again, Dropbox is coming from kind of the consumer market into the business market, so they still don't have a whole lot of security available. If you're an IT admin, it's difficult to do things like put password complexity requirements or expiration requirements and that kind of thing. Although Dropbox is encrypted, of course, both in transit and at rest. They also support two-factor authentication. They are single sign-on friendly if you have a third-party single sign-on vendor you would like to use. They're available on most mobile devices, and as we mentioned before, they integrate with Microsoft Office mobile apps.
And now I'm going to talk about the OneDrive for Business option, sort of as a compare and contrast. So while Dropbox, its primary sort of mode of approaching this gap problem is to do the file sync and do it really, really, really well. OneDrive for Business, I'd say its primary mode and approach is the Microsoft Office integration. So if you were to sign up for OneDrive but choose not to use Microsoft Office because you still liked WordPerfect 5.1 or for whatever reason really wanted to use OpenOffice, which is a nice suite, but it doesn't have integration with OneDrive. I think already you're sort of missing some of the advantages of OneDrive. So that Microsoft Office integration, where when you open and save files from Microsoft Office, whether it's Word or PowerPoint or Excel or whatever, you are presented with cloud storage right off the bat. That's very powerful. There is a file syncing utility, as we already alluded to. The syncing utility's performance is not nearly as good as Dropbox. We've had a number of clients who really struggled with it. I use OneDrive and SharePoint, which is I want to skip to the fourth bullet point. It's a companion to SharePoint. So it's all part of the Office 365 suite. OneDrive for Business is sort of focused on files that you're saving for your own use or in order to share with just a few people. But things that are sort of shared to team libraries would be done with SharePoint, where you know that if you save it to that team site, that team library, whether it's the team that all of your organization's a member of or a team that's just maybe just the finance department that you're a member of, that the members of that team can access it. There's no need to share it explicitly. It's already shared sort of the moment that it's saved there, and they can browse there and they can sync that site. OneDrive for Business, it only gets synced by the owner of the OneDrive account. So I can sync my OneDrive folder, but Pat, for example, can't sync my OneDrive folder. He can access a file on my OneDrive folder that I've shared with him by using the link or by going to his OneDrive, and there's a little thing on his OneDrive in the browser window that says, shared with me, and he can see all the files and folders that have been shared with him. So the file syncing utility, I have used it, but I'm constantly finding that I need to resync manually. Do what's called a resync, where it saves everything and sort of re-downloads my OneDrive folder. it's just not as strong as Dropbox's implementation. They do have, as we mentioned, the web browser-based editors, and it's getting better all the time. And this is becoming a real strength of sort of the OneDrive SharePoint solution set, for sure. So OneDrive for Business, I think, is a powerful cloud file storage solution for sure. So some of the specs for OneDrive for Business, this is sort of an analog to the one that Pat just did for Dropbox. There's some interesting things here. So the storage limit was 1 terabyte. It was much less than 1 terabyte. I don't remember what it was, but in the summer, late summer, I think they raised it to 1 terabyte. And then within I don't know, 2 months or so, Microsoft said, you know what, it's unlimited. You can save as much as you want. And so there's really obviously, first of all, storage is getting very, very cheap in these data centers. So that's one thing that's going on here. But also, there's obviously competition amongst all of these services to have, to meet the specifications of the competition. So the file size limit is 10 gigabytes. That's significant. Dropbox is unlimited if you're using the Sync app. It's hard for me to imagine practically that the value of trying to work with files in the cloud that are bigger than 10 gigabytes, but it could be that it would be important to have that file size limit be greater than 10 gigabytes. It is not. It is 10 gigabytes. The third bullet point on this technical specs part here is, as a number of people have blogged about it, if you look for people who are detractors of OneDrive for Business. They love it, except that the maximum number of files, at least in terms of what you can sync, is 20,000 files. And that's a lot of files, but at the same time, people have a lot of files. And that can be a deal killer for people who are looking at OneDrive. And so there are people who have Dropbox, like it okay, would be interested in OneDrive as an alternative, particularly if they like some of the other things that come with Office 365, but they can't get past that 20,000 limit. I happen to know from reading some of these blogs and the comments that get posted by the Microsoft people that reply to these things, that they're working hard to. Apparently it's a tough technical problem for them, and I don't know quite why that is, whether it's because it's a SQL backend or what, but they're trying to solve that problem because they realize, of course, that that's an important thing. Moving right along, I think all of our regular webinar attenders know that OneDrive is part of Office 365, and that Office 365 is very generously provided for qualified 501c3 organizations. The basic enterprise level E1 is provided for free to those nonprofits. So that's obviously very compelling. And then, as part of sort of Microsoft's business, while Dropbox came out of sort of the consumer side of things and focused on things like being really easy to use and just sort of working, OneDrive and SharePoint came out of Microsoft's enterprise focus and frame of reference, and so they do things like security, of course, I think are probably stronger on their side of things. You can sync your passwords with your local domain account so that that this takes a little bit of setup work, but we do it for clients that ask for this, particularly as part of email migrations, that the password can be the same as your domain password. You can obviously at that point then you can enforce all sorts of password policies. And then I should mention that Microsoft's advancing quickly to leveraging Azure to improve security, to provide things like single sign-on and so on. And like Dropbox, I think it's probably close to its equal on mobile devices. I don't know. I'm sure there's a Windows Phone app for OneDrive for Business. I'm not sure if there's a Windows Phone app for Dropbox yet. If there isn't, I'm sure because of this partnership there will be soon. But I think they're for the general user that they're comparable in that regard.
So Dropbox and OneDrive, we talked about them because they're good examples of current approaches to the cloud file storage solutions. Dropbox is a good solution if the sync approach is something that's required for your organization. If you need those files to be local and need them to be synced to the cloud as well, especially if you have a lot of users who have limited or limited internet access or travel a lot, and if the issues around collaboration can be managed outside the solution itself, outside the Dropbox for Business solution. On the other hand, OneDrive is compelling as part of a larger commitment to Microsoft. So if your workplace is the kind of place where you use Outlook for email, and everybody has Word and Excel and PowerPoint, and that's what you use, then OneDrive and Office 365 definitely have a lot of strengths.
All right. Thank you so much, Pat and Steve. We are not even close to done with this webinar. We have a lot of excellent questions, and we're going to get to each and every one of them. We have some great questions from that were asked prior to the webinar during registration, and we actually have slides for those. And so we really appreciate all of the interaction we've been getting from the audience. So hang tight, don't leave. We are going to get to all of your questions. Before we do, I just want to remind everyone that we have our March webinar coming up. We do these webinars every month on the third Thursday of the month from 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Standard Time. And next month, we're going to be joined by our CEO, David Deal, and our strategist, Peter Miras. They're going to talk about how data quality defines your organization. So we go from this month talking about some of the best ways to store files and documents to talking about how to make sure that the data that you're storing has a lot of quality and what kind of impact that can have on your organization. Just a quick reminder, after the webinar is over, please connect with us. We're on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, and LinkedIn. You can find us on all of those social media sites. You can come to our website. We have a great article that Pat wrote about OneDrive versus Dropbox. We'll tweet that out. We're going to send out a short survey after the webinar, and we really appreciate everyone's time in filling out that survey and responding to it. We've been doing these webinars for several years now. We love doing them, and we really require your feedback to make sure that they stay relevant and valuable to the nonprofit tech community. And if you missed anything today, we'll probably go a little bit past 5 just based on the number of questions we have. If you have to leave right at 5, we don't get to your question, the recording will be posted on our website and on our YouTube channel. So you can access the recording and the slides there. So moving on to the questions, let's go ahead and start with the questions that we received prior to the webinar as part of the registration process. Once we get through those, we will tackle all of the questions that are coming in right now. Great questions coming in from the audience right now.
As Johan mentioned, a lot of these questions are from the original registration for the webinar. So there was some questions about the ability to lock documents, about file locking. In OneDrive, there is the ability to lock documents if you're going through the browser. At the same time, if you're editing through the browser, or if you're editing with the integration to Microsoft Office, OneDrive allows simultaneous editing. So there's not really a need in that sense to really lock the document. But if you want to lock it down, make sure that no one else can edit it while you're making changes, you can lock it down. In Dropbox, it does not have that ability. Again, it is a very simple file syncing utility. Pretty much that's it.
Pat, I wanted to just quickly tell that story yesterday about how yesterday Pat and I were working on this. This is a PowerPoint slide deck that you guys are looking at, and we were sitting in our office in the same big room, but both of us had our headphones on, and sort of our culture let each other work, don't interrupt each other or whatever. And I was working on this, and he was working on it as well. And I wasn't even paying it, didn't even notice a little thing that pops up at the bottom that says, Pat is editing this. He knew I was editing it, but essentially the take-home message is that whenever I was saving it fairly frequently. Whenever I would save the deck, any changes that I made would appear. Well, they wouldn't immediately appear for Pat, but when he saved subsequently, not only would he would therefore write his changes to the cloud in the PowerPoint software, but he would also read the changes I had made and just saved. So unless we were actually editing the same sentences, there might have been problems. But we were, he owned some of these slides and I owned some of the slides, so that we weren't getting each other's way. But every time I would save things, I would say, oh, look, Pat's changed slide 22 and slide 23. And then he would, so it's really pretty cool how the collaboration problem has been solved as long as you're working, in an office. I don't think that it necessarily works if you're using OneDrive to save your PDF documents that you're manipulating with Adobe Acrobat. It doesn't do that. But within the Office ecosystem, it really does a good job.
Yeah. Okay, so are these two moving to a partnership? Kind of. They announced the partnership back in November, but it's really more targeted at the consumers, and it's also very much targeted at the kind of the mobile app infrastructure. So the iOS and the Android, and I guess to a lesser degree the Windows apps of the world. It's not really something that Microsoft probably expects will compete with its enterprise offerings. Microsoft's offering is pretty much the whole OneDrive, SharePoint, plus its integration with the Office 365 and email. And why is Dropbox easy to use and OneDrive so awkward, along with SharePoint? It's really because Dropbox is so simple. It really is, and that's both a blessing and a curse. It keeps the same Windows Explorer interface, and it tries to kind of replicate the same local file storage experience up to the cloud. Part of the problem, of course, as we discussed, is that it doesn't really work as well in the cloud. And so OneDrive, and to a greater degree SharePoint, is kind of a new approach to this solution. And that's a big part of why they're so different and so much more complex.
So one of the questions we got was, will SharePoint be mentioned as an option? Well, yes, it was mentioned. But I included this question. We didn't include all of the questions that came in the registration because some of them we knew were going to be addressed. But I wanted to just use this question as an opportunity to pitch this KB I found, this knowledge base article from Microsoft that I found. And you can sort of read the title there, but should I save my documents to OneDrive for business or to a team site? And the team site is a SharePoint team site. And I invite you all to sort of, if you're interested in sort of the differences between SharePoint and OneDrive, and they're not supposed to be competition for each other. They're supposed to be companion pieces. In fact, I would say OneDrive is just SharePoint. It's just a SharePoint site that's been modified slightly to be available only to a specific individual primarily, and to have ownership by a specific individual. This article talks about some of the differences, and I talked about them already a little bit also, about how when you save things in OneDrive, it's stuff that's supposed to be for your individual use or to be shared with just a few people sort of on an ad hoc basis, and team site stuff is for stuff that you know is going to be collaborative. Also, team site, SharePoint's a huge complex animal beyond just the place to store files, and so if you save things to a SharePoint site, it may well be that the library has workflow rules and a whole bunch of other stuff on top of it that might be important. I should mention just this whole thing with OneDrive. So this again, back to our example of this actual slideshow that we're watching right now. It's a PowerPoint slideshow, and the original, the sort of the first draft was done by Pat, and he saved it to his OneDrive folder and shared a link with me and shared it with Johan later. And so last night I was making some final adjustments, and I thought, I need Matt, our CTO, Matt, to just check these questions, these QA parts out. I want to make sure that we're following the community IT party line. And so I'd like Matt to look at this too. And so I was going to send him the link, and I realized, you know what? I can't just send him the link because he can't open this until Pat shares this this file with him explicitly, because it's a OneDrive file. It's not a team site file. And so this just points to, so I said, Pat, can you share this with Matt as well? And of course he did. But it sort of points to sort of the SharePoint OneDrive comparison. So another question we got was that someone was interested in using this cloud storage, whether it's OneDrive or Dropbox, as a backup, and they added that apparently recently Dropbox failed to keep some files that were and they were lost for this person because it was not set up properly, and there's no more details on that. I think that's interesting. We have seen clients try to use Dropbox as a backup solution. I mean, we don't like to see that. In fact, we would say you haven't got a backup solution there. They're not really a backup solution. A good backup solution, first of all, it just needs to have more logging. You need to know sort of every day that everything's synced. It's nice to have reporting. An enterprise backup solution should provide all of those things. Reporting, logging. It needs to sort of take a quote-unquote snapshot. That may not be exactly the right word, but you want to take something every day. Both of these solutions don't do that. They keep versions. So if you've modified a file, then the new version, the old version is saved, so that you can roll back to a previous version. But it's still sort of, the restore options on that are limited. It's done on a sort of file by file basis. The great example of sort of the limitations of it as a backup solution come to us through the, some of our clients unfortunately got the CryptoLocker virus in various times in 2014. It was a sort of a popular virus in 2014, sometimes also called, I think, the ransom virus or something like that, where a virus would basically encrypt all the files in a shared drive, rapidly go through it, and so people would try to open files up, and they couldn't. And the first time it happened to us, it was new, and the whole thing got encrypted, but it happened subsequent times. Like, you could see it getting, it's through the D's, it's working on the E's now, and we take the share offline, and it stops because it's actually running from a client desktop. So if you take the share offline, you stop it. But now you've got all these files encrypted. With a good backup, you would just restore to yesterday's version, and any modifications you made since yesterday are lost, but at least you have everything back. The CryptoLocker it's not even a new version. Encryption apparently isn't considered a version change. So we have found that when this has happened in a cloud storage situation, that we weren't even able to get a good restoration. You could maybe go back to a previous version for some of your files, but again, it's not like Dropbox allows you to roll back the whole drive to yesterday. That's something of sort of a file-by-file choice. I've talked a little longer than I meant to on this question, but I would say, in general, don't view any of these solutions as backup solutions. View them more as cloud storage solutions where you can have advantages of being able to access it anytime you're on the internet, and you can know that you have better availability than you do when you might have it on a local file server, but you're not really backing up files. And in fact, you might want to consider having backup solutions on top of these solutions. Here's the question: how do I stop Dropbox from filling up my laptop storage? And this is just an opportunity to sort of reiterate that this is a problem with the sync model. You can do selective sync as an incomplete solution to that. That means that's not really a great solution, because that sort of defeats the purpose of the whole Dropbox model. But yeah, Dropbox doesn't scale that well to really large file shares, and we do see this problem. We see this problem regularly. It's the sync approach to solving the gap problem can be great on a smaller scale, but when it starts to scale up and it can get out of control quickly, you really can have problems. So I'm taking on this slide. This is a series of slides with just one question, and I don't even know if I'm answering the question, but I wanted to answer it because I think it's illustrative of something about about OneDrive and by extension SharePoint. So the question is SkyDrive, which is the I don't think SkyDrive quote unquote exists anymore, but it's the old brand name for what's now OneDrive. And there's OneDrive and there's OneDrive for Business. So the person asked, SkyDrive lets me do things with spreadsheets that I can't do with OneDrive, like filter, unless I'm missing something. And I'm not sure exactly what they mean by filter, but I took it to mean that when I'm looking, I had this problem. This is why I was eager to answer this question. When I would open OneDrive up in my browser, which is how I basically interact with OneDrive, I wanted to see things in order, the files, not in alphabetical order. I wanted to see the files in my OneDrive in order of last modified. So I wanted to see the most recently modified first and down the row, because it pretty much was only working with the recent files. So how did I struggled with that. I can each time I opened it, I could click on something to make it refresh in a new in the view I wanted, but I wanted that to be my default view. So turns out you can do that, and I'll show you how to do that very quickly. So there's a gear up on the top right. You click on that. Then you get this page that has your site settings for OneDrive, and there's things like users and permissions and web designer. There's the look and feel. You can see all these things there. It's small in the screenshot, but one of the choices there is site libraries and lists. I clicked on that, and then that brings up site settings for this, just for the site libraries and lists. And so I want to customize the documents, the document sort of library of my OneDrive site. So I click on that, and this brings up a page, and this screenshot only shows like 30% of what's, you scroll through several screens, and there's lots of stuff on here that you can customize. But one of the things that you can customize at the very end is the views. And so I clicked on Create View, and then there's different view types: standard, calendar, database. So I clicked on Standard View, and then this brings up another whole page. And this again is like 30-40% of all the different things here. But you can change how you sort things, how you filter things. So the person asked about filtering, so that's what I have the red arrow pointing to. But above that is the sort button. So that's what I changed by sorting by date modified from ascending or descending. I don't remember which it was. This is, even the person who asked this, if I happen to answer the question that they were asking, which they said spreadsheets. I'm not even sure if I did. But if I did answer their question, I went too quickly. They're going to have to review the deck later to get the answer. Mostly, I just wanted to show you how you could say powerful and flexible OneDrive is, and by extension SharePoint. You can also flip of the coin of that is you can see how complex and almost overwhelming OneDrive and SharePoint can be. And SharePoint is even more so, because there's even more you can do, and you're doing it in a team-oriented fashion. So it's a big animal, OneDrive and SharePoint, and there's a lot to it.
So one common question we hear a lot is, what if you have large video files, large image files, and what's the best way to store those in the cloud? And to be honest, right now there isn't necessarily a best way to store those in the cloud. Several of our clients that are in this situation, often they have a media department or a communications department that does video or image editing. They typically actually have a NAS device, a network attached storage device, and they back it up with just an external hard drive and SneakerNet. They take it home every day or every week. Some options, though, are the Amazon S3 cloud might be worth considering. We suspect that in maybe even over the next year, options for storing these large files in the cloud might become more available, but so far it's not really what a lot of the cloud file storage companies are kind of targeting. They're more targeting the average business user, which is typically using documents and spreadsheets and PDFs kind of things.
I'm sorry, Pat, to interrupt, but I wanted to add something really quickly to that, because there was a question that came in also. Would you consider storing photos with either one of these solutions. And I think what we're seeing is that the file server, the traditional file server, was a very flexible solution, but that also made it less than ideal for doing good document management. You can put a lot of different types of files on a file server, and that's its great strength, but then the weakness becomes managing all of those files. And I think what we're seeing now with the cloud is a sort of differentiation where different solutions are going to become better at doing different things with different types of files. And so Dropbox to some extent, OneDrive and SharePoint to a greater extent, great document management solutions for your photos and videos. I think what we're going to see happen over the next 5 years is really good photo and video management solutions, digital asset management solutions essentially start to become more popular and more powerful and more affordable.
Yeah, and along those lines, it's worth mentioning that even within solutions, there are kind of these sub-solutions for that kind of thing. Dropbox, for example, has this feature called Carousel, which is designed to help you manage your photos. And they even have integration with Facebook, for example, so you can share your Dropbox. If you take a picture with your phone, it can save it directly to your Dropbox full app on the phone, and then it can share it directly up to Facebook, all automatically if you wanted to. So even within solutions, we're seeing some of that document management capability, taking advantage of that the capability of being in the cloud.
And one last thing I would just clarify: Amazon S3 is it's basically a sort of a bulk storage of files in the cloud, and it's very affordable. But I think if you were looking at sort of managing your photos and videos, you'd want to look at a more dedicated digital asset management solution like Extensys Portfolio, or I think Resource Space is another one that's relatively affordable.
Yeah, good stuff. So as Steve mentioned, Dropbox often has not Dropbox. OneDrive often has issues with not syncing very well. Generally, we prefer to use the website to directly edit documents in SharePoint and OneDrive. A lot of the editing that I did with this particular PowerPoint slide set was through the OneDrive online editor through Office Online. You do have to kind of sacrifice the file sync approach a little bit with OneDrive and with SharePoint. It's quite simply it doesn't work as well as it does in Dropbox. I suspect that may change in the future. I imagine that Microsoft will put some emphasis on developing a better solution. But right now, it's generally better to just use either the software itself or to use the online editor. And how do these options live alongside network drives? Yeah, as this person mentioned, it's difficult to sync an entire shared drive, which can be hundreds of gigs, to each person's computer. Generally, we see network drives becoming more the place for that archival data that's not actively being used on a day-to-day basis. I have clients, for example, that have maybe 40 staff, and they have 700 gigs on their file server, and a lot of that space is being used by stuff that's not really being used anymore. It's stuff that hasn't been looked at or edited for a year, even more. So that kind of data storage is the kind of thing that you might want to just keep locally in case someone needs to refer back to it now and then, but the active data information would be in the cloud. If you do have a lot of active data, though, then it's definitely true that the file sync approach doesn't really scale well to those large network shares. From the IT point of view, I'd rather see us using OneDrive since we have Office 365. So why is Dropbox so popular? Dropbox is very popular because it's something everybody's familiar with. Everybody's heard of Dropbox. Most people use it at home because it's free. It also has that very familiar interface. It's got that simple to understand sync approach, and it works better at doing that than OneDrive. So it definitely has a very strong appeal to staff. In terms of what it does differently, it's better at that sync approach. That's essentially what it does differently. OneDrive usage with SharePoint. It's as Steve shared that link before, that knowledge base article link. You can move the documents from OneDrive to SharePoint and vice versa. The easiest way I found to do it generally is actually just to download the document and then upload it to SharePoint. You can also use the sync to move them between each other as well. There's not really a direct way to move the files, one to the other, unfortunately. Not yet, anyway. And last question about connection speed. Connection speed can definitely be an issue with any cloud file storage solution. The file sync approach is definitely more forgiving if you have intermittent or poor internet access.
And then we had a question where someone just said, please tell us about the security risks for these solutions. And I think I want to emphasize that there's more similarities than differences. We did talk about some of the differences in terms of, password policies and so on. But it's worth mentioning here that that there are some security risks to having your files in the clouds. One of them is that your cloud provider has direct control of your files. They're on their servers, not on yours. So if you worry about things like secret subpoenas, and we do have nonprofit clients who do worry about that because of the kind of work that they do, government watchdog kinds of things, and so on. And so if you're worried about that kind of thing, there's an issue there because if the government subpoenas your files to Microsoft or to Dropbox, they're going to sort of hand them over without telling you, perhaps because they are compelled to from their perspective. Interestingly, I think it was just a couple weeks ago, maybe just last week, that Box, which is another important player in this space, announced that they were going to. I don't think it's rolled out yet, but they were going to add a functionality to their service where they will provide private encryption keys to their clients, so that the files are stored encrypted on Box's servers, but the only person that has the encryption key is you. And so and they would I think they were very clear that they don't want to get in between you and a government subpoena. So if the stuff is subpoenaed, they say you've got to give it over, or maybe we'll just delete your files or something. They don't want to have a battle there, but at least you would know about it, which is a big important thing. I mean, I think that's probably in the future all the way around, because there would be a lot of players, of organizations, enterprises for whom it's kind of critical that they have that kind of control over their data. And then there's always for every positive there's a negative, the other side of the coin, and the fact that yeah, it's great that at least you have, if you're using Dropbox or OneDrive for business, that you're using an enterprise service. Dropbox for business, I guess we should add that, but you are using an enterprise service that you're paying for, and that's better than the individually owned free editions of these solutions, because at least you have sort of ultimate control as the administrator of the account of the data that's stored in there, and that's an improvement. But there's still a lot of it's the fact that it's freely available to the people who are logged into under their account names anywhere on the internet. They can sync the data to any device. And so, preventing data leakage is still hard, or harder than it would be if you had your files on a network server. Although, it's hard anywhere because bring your own apps. People have their private Dropbox accounts running on their computers half the time, or they have them running in a browser. So you don't even. That's sort of we're getting into security, which is a different conversation. We'll probably come back to that in a later month. Last question.
I'm sorry, Steve. I want to just mention a few things about security. So one of the questions early on was interest in whether OneDrive data is secure at rest, and I think we've addressed that to a large degree. I do think that if you go and look at sort of what Microsoft offers in terms of security, it's pretty advanced. They have data loss protection built in, so you can secure documents from within Office itself. They also provide the ability to secure files, to encrypt files on a file-by-file basis. And they're kind of slowly bringing over a lot of the security encryption that they've built into their file server over the years into OneDrive and SharePoint Online. That having that level of security has been an enterprise requirement that Microsoft has had to build its solutions around over the years, and they're at the point of just bringing them over into the cloud, basically. Whereas Dropbox, it's never been a big issue for them coming from the consumer space, and that's something that they're, slowly kind of adding in. One audience member mentioned a service or software called Sukasa. We've tested one called Encrypted Cloud, which is basically a file encryption service that sits on top of Dropbox. And I think our initial testing of Encrypted Cloud was that it was incredibly complicated, and that while it worked, the complexity involved in using it was such that we were worried that we were going to end up encrypting a lot of files that we needed access to that we couldn't get access to. So, long term, obviously, I think having security at rest is the goal, and I'm not sure any solution does that great. Box, maybe with its recent announcement, is at the forefront of that, but I think that's something that will continue to be, a growing requirement.
Thanks, Johan. So the last question is, can you compare adoption barriers? And I think we've talked about this a lot. The fact that Dropbox's sync approach is just more familiar to people. It's going to have a lower adoption threshold. We have clients who have looked at both, and they chose Dropbox specifically because they were concerned that their typical user, and typical varies from organization to organization, but their typical user was going to struggle with anything other than just the simple Windows Explorer type view where you have a local folder that's syncing with a Dropbox. And this particular organization wasn't super small, but their file sharing needs were relatively small. They didn't have tons of files, both in numbers and in terms of gigabytes, that had to sync. And so I think it's probably a good fit for them. OneDrive, SharePoint, probably more scales better to a sort of a larger enterprise approach. I try to sell SharePoint / OneDrive to clients by saying, we really think that you're going to be happiest if your users can shift to the web browser paradigm. And that seems like too much, I think, at first blush. But as someone who I don't think of myself as being particularly change friendly, but I've been using SharePoint and OneDrive for my community IT work, and I basically almost exclusively access files from the browser, and I really like it. I like the fact that the search is right there and very quick. It seems like it should be a lot more clicks, but it doesn't turn out to be that bad. So it can work, but there is an adoption threshold, an adoption barrier to take on that new paradigm. I think that new paradigm, offers a lot in the long run, but there needs to be sort of change management and training for users, and then there needs to be sort of some not so much with OneDrive, which is sort of personal, but with SharePoint, some architectural investments up front to make it work.
Great.
And that's the last of the slides that we prepared ahead of time because we had these questions from registration. You said there were lots of questions.